Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Imagine for a moment that you are the operations manager for a massive, completely remote workforce.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. But here is the catch. The year is 1832.
Oh, so no internet.
Exactly. No internet, no smartphones, absolutely no tracking software. Yet you are so aggressively micromanaging your employees that you dictate the exact number of hours they must spend walking the streets.
Wow.
You censor the specific topics they're allowed to discuss with strangers, and get this, you will literally fire them if they spend more than 60 minutes at a prayer meeting.
It sounds like, the plot of some dystopian corporate novel.
Mm-hmm.
But the crazy thing is, it was the gritty reality of one of the most effective social and spiritual movements of the 19th century.
Yeah, today we are taking a granular, comprehensive look at the foundational records of the Edinburgh City Mission.
Which is just a fascinating period. We're looking at a landscape where the old ways of doing things had completely fractured.
Right, under the weight of the Industrial Revolution, basically.
Exactly. And a group of everyday citizens decided to build this highly optimized machine to fix it.
We have an incredible stack of primary sources for this deep dive, spanning from the mission's birth in 1832 all the way through 1898.
And these sources are amazing. We're talking about original meeting minutes, handwritten constitutions, deeply detailed financial ledgers that read, honestly, like modern corporate audits.
Yeah, and the actual printed literature, too, right? The tracts they handed out on the cobblestone streets.
Yes. The overarching goal for us today is to reverse engineer this organization. We really want to understand the exact mechanics of how a handful of citizens, just sitting in a shop, built a grassroots movement that permanently altered the social fabric of an entire city.
And for you listening right now, whether you study history, organizational management, or, you're just fascinated by how human beings actually persuade each other to change their lives, this is for you. We are going to dive into the raw psychology, the mass media tactics, and the surprisingly intense financial crises of 1830s Edinburgh.
To really grasp the magnitude of what they accomplished, we have to look at the massive paradigm shift they initiated. The mission's own 1840 biennial report highlights this brilliantly, I think.
Let's unpack that. What was the shift?
Well, for centuries, the established church operated on what the report calls the attractive method.
Okay, the attractive method, meaning what exactly?
Which, when you look at the social realities of the 1830s, was essentially a system of passive waiting. The report details how the establishment believed they had fulfilled their duty simply by existing.
So, if you build it, they will come, basically.
Pretty much. They built the stone cathedrals, they rang the bells on Sunday morning, and they waited for what they termed a spiritual banquet to be furnished with guests.
But I'm guessing that completely ignored the economic and cultural barriers of the era, right? I imagine attending a traditional Scottish church in that era wasn't as simple as just, walking through the doors. Especially if you were destitute.
Absolutely not simple.
Weren't there literal financial barriers, like pew rents?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is a crucial piece of the puzzle. In many established churches of the era, families paid rent for their pews.
Wow. So you literally had to buy a seat.
Yeah, it was a primary way churches funded themselves. So if you're a laborer crammed into a tenement in the poorest slums of Edinburgh, and you're struggling to afford bread during an economic downturn.
You definitely don't have the money for a pew.
Exactly. And beyond that, you likely don't have the respectable clothing required to sit among the middle and upper classes.
Oh, right. The social shame aspect.
Huge social shame. The attractive model was fundamentally broken because it relied on the destitute overcoming these massive socioeconomic hurdles just to get in the room to hear the message.
Right, which is why the report paints such a grim picture of the result. It describes multitudes living in a state little better than heathen, just entirely alienated from the institutions of the city.
Exactly. So the paradigm shift the founders proposed was moving from that passive attractive model to a radically aggressive model.
Okay, an aggressive model, meaning going to them.
Yes. If the people couldn't or wouldn't come to the institution had to be dismantled and carried piece by piece directly into the highways, the streets, and the deepest slums of the city.
That makes me think of a modern analogy. It's like the difference between a traditional brick and mortar store just waiting for foot traffic versus a direct-to-consumer, door-to-door outreach campaign.
That is a perfect analogy. And undertaking an aggressive campaign of that scale requires a meticulously designed operational framework.
Right, because the institutional church wasn't equipped for this kind of guerrilla outreach.
No, not at all, which necessitated the creation of an entirely new kind of organization.
That brings us to the drafting of the blueprint. Let's travel back to the founding meeting on March 1st, 1832.
A very important date.
Yeah, and they aren't meeting in a grand hall or a cathedral, are they?
No, they are sitting in the shop of Messrs. Young and Miller.
Right, at 375 High Street in Edinburgh. It's just a small group of laymen.
Right.
Mr. Spence, Mr. Miller, Mr. Boyd, Mr. MacDonald.
But the catalyst in that room is a man named David Naismith.
Naismith, who was he exactly?
The historical records position Naismith as a sort of serial entrepreneur of 19th century urban missions.
Oh, so this wasn't his first rodeo.
Not at all.
Oh.
He had already successfully launched similar city missions in Glasgow, in Dublin, and across America.
Wow, okay. So he didn't just bring passion to that high street shop. He brought a battle-tested playbook.
Exactly. And looking at the Constitution they drafted that day, Naismith's operational genius is, it's blindingly obvious. He builds a decentralized, scalable model.
How did that work in practice?
Well, they took the entire map of Edinburgh and carved it up into specific geographical districts.
Smart. Divide and conquer.
Right. Each district was placed under the operational control of a local manager called a superintendent. And underneath them, they deployed a hybrid workforce. Yeah. So you had paid full-time agents, the missionaries, working alongside a volunteer force of what they called private Christians.
So it's essentially a franchise model for social reform.
Very much so. But the most radical component of this blueprint is buried in Article 2 of the Constitution.
Okay, what does it say?
It explicitly states that the design of the society is to carry this message to the people, quote, irrespective of denominational distinction.
Irrespective of denominational distinction. Now, to a modern listener, interdenominational charity sounds like, well, the most standard corporate nonprofit language imaginable.
Right, it sounds totally normal to us.
But in the context of 1830 Scotland, I have to assume this was practically an act of rebellion. The theological tribalism at that time was incredibly fierce, wasn't it?
Well, it was an absolute powder keg. You have to remember that 19th century Scotland was defined by intense, deeply embedded Presbyterian schisms.
Like fighting over church governance and things like that.
Exactly. Churches were dividing over incredibly nuanced points of church governance, patronage, and state interference.
Wow.
And these weren't polite disagreements. They were bitter, society-cleaving disputes.
But to step into that environment and declare that your organization would completely ignore these denominational battle lines?
It was an enormous operational risk. They were focusing solely on a unified, baseline message of salvation.
It also seems like a massive threat to the professional clergy. The 1840 report confirms this, actually. It states that the employment of an agency like the City Mission was initially viewed with intense suspicion.
Yes, the report notes a strong prejudice against direct efforts by laymen.
It was entirely a turf war over authority, wasn't it?
It really was. For generations, the theological instruction of the public was the heavily guarded monopoly of ordained, university-educated clergymen.
Right, you needed the credentials.
Exactly. So the idea that unordained, everyday citizens laymen with no formal theological degrees would be walking door to door, reading scripture, and offering spiritual counsel.
That challenged the very hierarchy of the era.
The establishment viewed it as chaotic, potentially heretical, and a direct threat to their institutional control.
But the founders of the mission were fully aware of this friction, and they just doubled down on their belief in the power of the individual over the institution.
They did.
There is this staggering quote from the chairman at a public meeting recorded in the 1840-1841 report. He addresses the crowd and says, "One Bible is worth 1,000 penal statutes, and one active missionary will do more good than a whole legion of policemen."
That is such a powerful statement. And to appreciate the gravity of that statement, we really must look at what those penal statutes actually entailed.
Right, because the 1830s British penal system was pretty draconian, wasn't it?
Draconian is the word. This was an era where minor thefts, which were often just driven by sheer starvation, could result in deportation to penal colonies in Australia.
Wow. Just for stealing food.
Yeah, or even capital punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Debtors' prisons were a grim reality.
So the civic authorities basically attempted to control the exploding, impoverished urban populations purely through the threat of horrific external punishment.
Exactly. So the chairman is making a profound sociological argument here. He is asserting that you cannot club or imprison a city into morality.
Right. External state-sponsored violence is vastly inferior to internal psychological transformation.
Yes. An everyday layman with a book, building a relationship in a tenement stairwell, can achieve a level of civic order and human flourishing that the entire police force cannot.
It is a radical thesis on human nature. But deploying an army of zealous laymen to execute this vision creates an immediate, severe logistical problem.
Oh, absolutely. How do you control them?
Right. If you are sending uneducated men into the most volatile districts of the city to talk about deeply emotional topics, the potential for disaster seems astronomical.
You're talking theological arguments, political riots, or even just sheer laziness.
Which is why Naismith and the board couldn't just rely on good intentions. They had to implement an incredibly rigid system of oversight.
It really did.
When we look at their instructions to missionaries document, the level of micromanagement is breathtaking. It basically functions like a modern corporate compliance manual.
Rule 10, for example, strictly dictates their daily schedule.
What did it say?
The agents were required to spend 5 to 6 hours every single day visiting from house to house.
Every single day. Wow.
Furthermore, they were mandated to hold at least 3 prayer meetings every week. But, and this is fascinating, the board added a caveat. Those prayer meetings were explicitly capped at 1 hour each.
Wait, they capped prayer. The 1 hour cap is such a revealing detail. You have an organization built entirely on spiritual fervor, yet they are putting a strict stopwatch on the actual religious gatherings.
Yes, exactly.
It tells you that the board recognized the human tendency to gravitate toward the comfortable. I mean, it is much easier and warmer to sit in a room with a group of people who already agree with you and sing hymns for 3 hours than it is to walk back out into the freezing Edinburgh rain and knock on the doors of hostile strangers.
That's exactly it. They engineered the rules to force the agents outward. Rule 11 compelled every missionary to act under the direct supervision of their local superintendent.
Okay, so a chain of command.
Right. And, crucially, to keep a highly detailed journal of their daily proceedings.
Okay, let's talk about those journals because they are essentially 19th century data dashboards. They weren't just keeping personal diaries.
No, not at all.
They were logging key performance indicators. The 1842 minutes reveal that the board actually mandated uniform practices for how these men recorded their time.
Yes, they had specific time and attendance columns to track every single hour of their shift.
It's wild. But the oversight wasn't limited to just how long they worked. It strictly governed what they were allowed to say.
This is where we see the board actively mitigating the risk of that denominational powder keg we discussed earlier.
How so?
Well, Rule 4 bluntly orders the agents to beware of seeking to promote the interests of a party.
Okay.
And Rule 9 goes even further. It says, avoid all unnecessary controversy upon religious subjects and politics.
I have to pause here because this seems inherently contradictory to me.
How so?
Well, their primary directive, Rule 1, is to bring the inhabitants to an awareness of human depravity and the necessity of salvation.
Right.
So how on earth does a missionary walk into a stranger's home, tell them they are in spiritual peril, and simultaneously avoid religious controversy? I mean, the very premise of their visit is controversial.
What's fascinating here is that you've hit on the central tension of the entire operation.
Yeah.
The board knew that discussing baseline salvation would provoke individual friction. What they were terrified of was institutional friction.
Oh, I see.
If a missionary knocked on a door and spent 3 hours arguing with a resident about whether the state should have patronage over church appointments, which was the dominant political religious argument of the day, that missionary was wasting company time.
Okay. So the avoid controversy rule was basically a gag order on tribalism. It was a mechanism for operational efficiency. If you are debating the finer points of church governance, you aren't logging your 5 hours of house-to-house visitation, and you aren't delivering the core product.
Precisely. They heavily prioritized the sheer volume of the mission over the nuance of the theology.
Makes sense from a management perspective.
They forced the agents to stick to a highly specific stripped-down script. And the historical records prove that the board did not hesitate to ruthlessly enforce these rules.
Yeah, the meeting minutes from December 1834 are a perfect example of this.
Oh, the Duncan Forbes incident.
Yes. They contain this brief, almost cold entry stating that the board dispensed with the services of an agent named Duncan Forbes.
And the stated reason.
Ongoing conflicts with the rules of the society. They fired him.
They did.
It just proves this wasn't some loose fellowship. It was an employment contract with zero tolerance for insubordination.
The board's ruthless focus on efficiency is even more apparent in the ongoing multi-year drama regarding the missionaries attending university classes. Yeah.
This might be the most relatable corporate dispute in the entire archive.
It really is.
Starting around November 1833, the board cautiously allowed some of their missionaries to attend university classes on the side.
Right, because these were ambitious laymen.
Yeah, and many of them saw the mission as a stepping stone to becoming formally ordained clergy, which obviously required higher education.
But by 1837, this side hustle had become a crisis. The committee held lengthy, heated discussions because they realized these university aspirations were directly prejudicing the mission's work.
It's the 19th century equivalent of a remote worker doing a coding boot camp while they're supposed to be answering customer service tickets.
That's spot on.
The agents were likely exhausted from studying or cutting their house-to-house hours short to write essays, so the board brings the hammer down.
They unanimously resolved to grant a maximum of only 1 hour of college attendance per day.
1 hour.
If you want to work for the Edinburgh City Mission, the mission owns your time.
Wow. Enforcing these strict rules and ensuring men are walking the streets for 6 hours a day instead of working in a factory or studying, that means you have to provide them with a living wage.
You do.
Which leads us directly into the financial engine of the organization, because the operational scale they achieved required an immense amount of capital.
Absolutely. We have the actual treasurer's accounts from the 1841 period and later from 1848.
And they read like a modern corporate audit. It is fascinating to look at the granular economics of 19th century salvation.
It really is. They set the salary for a married missionary at £50 per year.
To give that some context, £50 in the 1840s was a respectable, though modest, working-class income, right?
Yes. It was enough to keep a family fed and housed in modest conditions, ensuring the missionary didn't have to seek secondary employment.
Got it.
But the ledgers revealed that salaries were just the baseline. The overhead costs of sustaining this aggressive campaign were staggering.
The itemized expenses are such a window into their daily reality. We see £23 spent purely on printing the biennial report.
Which is a lot of money back then.
Yeah, and there is a druggist's account for medicines supplied directly to the missionaries, totaling over £4.
And perhaps most revealing, there are regular payments for coach hires for a Dr. Charles Rainsford.
Who was he?
He is listed as the official medical attendant for the missionaries and their families.
Those medical line items are a stark reminder of the physical danger of the job. I mean, walking house to house in the most impoverished, overcrowded districts of 1830s Edinburgh meant walking into epicenters of disease.
Cholera and typhus outbreaks were frequent and devastating.
Right.
The board recognized that they were sending their workforce into hazardous conditions, and they had to build a medical infrastructure to keep their frontline workers alive.
But building that infrastructure nearly broke them.
It did.
The cash flow records from 1835 show the board in a state of constant panic scrambling. They are repeatedly drawing small, desperate increments, £20 here, £40 there, from their bankers, Sir William Forbes and Company.
Just to keep the local district accounts from defaulting.
And by 1838, the scrambling devolves into a full-blown financial crisis. The ledgers show that the 4th District alone owed the Central Society an astonishing £146.
Let's just pause on that number.
Yeah.
If a missionary makes £50 a year, how does a single geographical district rack up nearly 3 years' worth of a man's salary in debt?
Exactly. Where was that money leaking to?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it was a flaw in the franchise model.
Okay. How so?
Each district was theoretically supposed to be self-sustaining. They were supposed to raise funds from local residents to pay their specific missionary, rent their local meeting halls, and purchase the tracts they distributed.
But I'm guessing some districts were poorer than others.
Exactly. The 4th District was likely one of the most impoverished areas. They had all the overhead costs, the £50 salary, the rent, the literature, and likely informal charitable relief given to starving families, but zero ability to raise local subscriptions.
So the Central Board had to continuously subsidize them.
Yes, draining the general reserves.
Which brings us to the unsung heroes of this entire historical record.
The ladies' associations.
Yes. When you look at the receipt side of the 1841 accounts, the General Fund, which was the money raised directly by the male-dominated board, brought in a mere £107.
Barely anything.
But right below that, there is a line item for the ladies' associations, and their contribution is a massive organization saving £603.
It is an incredible disparity. The formal, institutional mechanisms were failing, and the grassroots networks of women were single-handedly floating the entire operation.
How were they doing it? Women in the 1840s obviously weren't sitting on corporate boards or controlling vast independent fortunes. How do they generate 6 times the revenue of the Central Committee?
They leveraged the only sphere of influence available to them, the domestic and social network.
Okay.
While the men held the public meetings, the ladies' associations utilized drawing room fundraising.
So networking.
Yes. They relentlessly canvassed their own neighborhoods, collected small weekly penny subscriptions from middle-class households, and managed localized bazaars.
Wow.
They turned the microeconomics of the domestic sphere into a macroeconomic engine. They funded roughly 85% of the mission's operations during its most critical crisis.
They were the venture capitalists of the 19th century charity world. I mean, the men drafted the Constitution, but these women were the silent partners who bought the Bibles, paid the salaries, and ensured the 4th District didn't go bankrupt.
Absolutely.
But even with the women's heroic efforts, the board realized they needed a broader, more sustainable influx of capital. They had to go public.
And they did so with a massive display of public relations.
What did we do?
In November 1841, facing depleted funds, they rented out the Waterloo Rooms.
Which was a big deal.
Oh, yes. It was one of the premier public venues in Edinburgh. They didn't just hold a meeting, they orchestrated an event.
I see.
They secured the sheriff of the county to chair it, lending immediate civic credibility. They brought in heavy-hitting, famous orators of the day, like Reverend Candlish and Reverend Alexander,
to systematically make the case to the wealthy citizens of Edinburgh that funding the mission was essential for the survival of the city.
Exactly. And the strategy was wildly successful.
The numbers back that up. The 1848 accounts show a staggering evolution. Total receipts surged to over £12,248.
A massive leap.
The PR campaign worked so well that they secured a brand new massive influx of £507 coming directly from formal church congregations, which proves they had finally overcome the establishment's initial suspicion.
They were even flush enough to hire a general superintendent at a premium salary of £100 a year just to oversee the massive scale of the operation.
The financial crisis forced them to mature from a scrappy startup into a highly solvent, professionally managed institution.
It really did.
So the massive PR events and the ladies' associations generated the capital. That capital paid the agents and bought the literature. But what exactly were they buying?
Right, the tracts.
Yeah, what were the psychological tactics embedded in the paper these men were handing to strangers in the slums? Let's open up their arsenal of persuasion.
The foundational text for this is the mission's official registry of approved tracts. We have to recall Rule 8 of their operating manual.
Remind me what that one was.
No tract or book to be circulated by you which has not been approved by the managers.
So the board exercised absolute editorial control over the messaging.
Absolute control.
And the titles they approved are brilliant. They are engineered for maximum curiosity. They read exactly like a modern internet clickbait headline.
Oh, they do?
Listen to a few of these. The Swearer's Prayer, A Peep at the Races, The Dairyman's Daughter, A Narrow Escape from the Punishment of Death.
So specific.
Right. If you are walking down a bleak gray street in 1840s Edinburgh and someone hands you a pamphlet titled A Narrow Escape from the Punishment of Death, you are going to read it.
They understood the necessity of a hook. But we can see exactly how sophisticated their internal rhetorical architecture became by looking at the later 1898 bound volumes from the Scottish Monthly Visitor Tract Society.
Before we dissect the specific text of these tracts, I just want to reiterate to you listening that we are examining a highly charged, historically specific religious literature.
Right.
We're looking at this impartially. We are not endorsing the theology or taking a side on the religious claims. Our goal here is to analyze the mechanics of the messaging, how these writers use psychology, fear, and comfort to persuade their readers.
It is a fascinating study in mass media communication. A premier example of this is the January 1898 tract written by Reverend F.B. Meyer, forcefully titled, Now, Now.
The use of all caps and repetition in a 19th century title, they were shouting off the page.
The entire document is built upon a profound theology of urgency. It opens by grounding the reader in a vivid, dramatic anecdote about a famous Scottish minister named R.M. M'Cheyne.
What's the story?
So M'Cheyne is traveling through the rural region of Aberdeenshire and decides he wants to preach in a local village on a random Sunday afternoon. He approaches the local minister, but the minister tells him it is impossible. There is no afternoon service scheduled, and there is no mechanism to call the widely dispersed villagers together.
M'Shane, undeterred, asks, "Cannot you ring the bell?" And the local minister replies with a very practical objection. He says, if they heard the bell ring, they would think there was a fire.
Which sets up M'Shane to deliver a devastating rhetorical pivot. He looks at the minister and says, but it's a case of fire.
Wow.
He is metaphorically referring to the fires of hell, positioning the spiritual state of the village as an immediate life or death emergency that supersedes polite scheduling. The tract notes that the minister was convinced, the bell was rung, the terrified villagers rushed out, and M'Shane delivered his message.
That anecdote perfectly primes the reader for the intense psychological pressure that follows. The text of the Now W tract looks the reader directly in the eye and states, "You are not safe, for at any moment you might meet with sudden death."
And in an era before antibiotics, where industrial accidents and disease were rampant, that wasn't an abstract theological threat.
Right. It was a daily, visceral reality. They used the genuine fragility of 19th century life as leverage.
It is an aggressive use of fear. However, if you only use fear, the reader paralyzes. The brilliance of this tract is how rapidly it pivots from terrifying pressure to the most radical, accessible comfort imaginable, delivered through masterful analogies.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's unpack those analogies because they systematically dismantle every psychological defense the reader might have. The tract starts with the image of a lifeboat.
Okay.
It says, "The lifeboat is now for the last time alongside the sinking vessel. Make haste, step in, the next wave may catch it and bear it beyond reach." It demands immediate physical action without requiring the reader to understand how the boat works. Just get in.
Then it anticipates the reader's first internal excuse, moral inadequacy.
Like, I'm not good enough.
Exactly. The reader thinks, my life is a mess. I am too inconsistent to adopt a religious life. The tract counters this by deploying the biblical story of the prodigal son. But it highlights a very specific psychological mechanism. It points out that the prodigal didn't wait to find clean clothes or wash the mud off himself before starting for home. He went exactly as he was, and in doing so, he threw the whole responsibility on his father.
Wow.
The tract essentially tells the destitute reader, you don't have to fix yourself. Come as you are and force God to take responsibility for your past.
It even utilizes a deeply domestic, comforting image to reinforce this. It promises the reader that God will be their rearward.
Rearward.
Yeah. It explains this by comparing God to a mother walking behind a chaotic toddler, gathering up the many things it has left undone and untidy, and putting right the knots that had been left in a tangle.
That's beautiful.
They are taking vast, intimidating theological concepts like atonement and justification and translating them into the language of a mother untangling a child's shoelaces.
It's engineered to be emotionally gripping and intellectually frictionless.
Yeah.
The writer then moves to the next common excuse. Emotional apathy. The reader says, I understand the offer, but I have so little desire to change. The tract responds with the historical analogy of the smoking flax.
We need to explain that one because a modern audience doesn't use flax lamps.
Sure. In that era, a flax wick and an oil lamp that was merely smoking was on the verge of dying out. It provided no light, only an irritating smoke.
Right.
The natural human impulse is to pinch it out and throw it away, but the tract uses this to represent a person with barely a flicker of spiritual desire. It argues that instead of snuffing it out, Jesus says, I must take all the more care of it, I will manage it.
It assures the reader that even a pathetic, smoking ember of desire is enough to qualify for rescue.
Yes. The burden of fanning that flame into a fire is placed entirely on the rescuer, not the reader.
The final excuse they dismantle is the lack of faith. The reader says, I simply don't believe strongly enough. The tract delivers an absolutely brilliant medical counter-narrative.
This one is my favorite.
It asks the reader to imagine a physician. A physician isn't going to drop everything to attend to the minor finger ache of some fine lady, but if a tiny child is desperately ill and clinging to life, that same physician will cancel his schedule and spend the entire night by the child's bedside.
The profound rhetorical twist is this. Your weakness, your lack of faith, your spiritual sickness makes you more interesting and attractive to the Savior, not less.
They cap this argument off with a story from a well-known figure, Dr. Andrew Bonar, about an old Scotch woman. She was highly regarded in her community, and people traveled to see her because she was famous for possessing great faith.
But when someone compliments her on her great faith, she immediately rejects the premise.
What does she say?
She replies, "Great faith. Nay, nay, but I have a great Lord."
Which is the thesis statement of their entire mass media strategy. She completely divorces the power of the rescue from the strength of the person being rescued.
The psychological barrier to entry is lowered to absolute zero.
Yes. You do not need to be educated. You do not need a clean moral record. You do not need overwhelming emotional desire. And you don't even need strong belief. You just have to stop actively resisting the lifeboat.
Exactly. Now, when you read messaging that is so perfectly tailored to the weak, the destitute, and the uneducated, it is incredibly easy to assume that these tracts were exclusively a tool for managing the lower classes in the slums.
Right, that would be the logical assumption.
But the archives contain a powerful case study that completely shatters that assumption. Let's look at the tract from February 1898, which profiles the life of Sir Arthur Blackwood.
Sir Arthur Blackwood. This represents a jarring demographic shift in the mission's literature, doesn't it?
Oh, a massive shift. He was a quintessential man of Victorian high society. His pedigree was impeccable.
Right.
His grandfather was a captain at the Battle of Trafalgar, serving directly under Admiral Lord Nelson.
Right.
And was actually a witness to Nelson's final will on board the HMS Victory.
Wow.
Blackwood was born into wealth, privilege, and the highest tiers of societal influence.
The tract notes that despite growing up in a very comfortable home with pious influences, Blackwood completely abandoned all religious duties the moment he entered young adulthood. He was a man of the world, immersed in the ballroom culture of London.
But his narrative takes a drastic turn in 1854, during the outbreak of the Crimean War. Blackwood is appointed as a young officer on the commissariat staff with the Brigade of Guards.
And we must understand the environmental shock he experienced there. The Crimean War, specifically the Siege of Sebastopol, was an absolute nightmare of logistical failure and human suffering.
Utter nightmare.
Blackwood went from the opulent drawing rooms of London to freezing trenches knee-deep in mud. He was surrounded by rampant cholera, dysentery, freezing conditions, and the daily horrific casualties of mid-19th century artillery warfare.
The tract highlights a moment of profound psychological crisis for him. Standing amidst the misery of the siege, surrounded by young men dying in agony, he realizes he has absolutely nothing of substance to offer them.
Awful.
He feels keenly the misery of not being able to speak a single word of genuine comfort. His spiritual nature, as the text describes it, was completely asleep, entirely unequipped for the reality of mortality.
But his awakening begins not with a grand sermon, but with the arrival of a simple package of books from home. Specifically, a small tract-like book titled The Sinner's Friend.
Sent by his mother.
Yes, who, the tract explicitly notes, prayed for him daily. What I find so authentic about this account is that Blackwood doesn't have an immediate epiphany.
He doesn't.
He is an arrogant young officer. He completely ignores the book at first. He tosses it aside. It is only later, out of the sheer agonizing boredom of a protracted military siege, that he finally opens it.
And he reads it over and over.
Right. He later admits, very frankly, that there was nothing intellectually spectacular in the book. It wasn't calculated to impress a wealthy young man of the world, but it planted a single vital idea: that genuine peace and happiness might actually be found in a religious life, rather than the societal ladder he had been climbing.
That intellectual seed lay dormant until it was watered by two environmental factors.
What were they?
First, he finds himself sharing a tent with a fellow soldier who, despite the exhaustion and the brutality of the siege, quietly kneels in prayer every single night and morning. The quiet consistency of that witness wears down Blackwood's cynicism.
Okay, and the second?
Second, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, simply because he has nothing better to do, he wanders into an upper room communion service being held in the port town of Balaclava.
He stays for the service, and he describes the experience as taking the sacramental oath to live an entirely different life.
But the true test of this transformation doesn't happen in the mud of Crimea. It happens when the war ends and he returns to England.
Oh, right. Back to high society.
He steps back into London, and he is suddenly paralyzed by the tension between his newfound faith and the expectations of his social class. He is torn between the Bible and the ballroom.
So what does he do?
He confesses his misery to a friend, and the friend gives him incredibly practical advice. He says, if you want peace, go try to do good to the souls of others.
So Blackwood takes the aggressive method into the heart of the British aristocracy.
He does.
Literally, during a high society dance, surrounded by the elite of London, he begins walking up to people and trying to initiate conversations about their spiritual state.
Which is social suicide.
Completely. The tract notes he was laughed at and mocked by his peers, But in doing so, the internal tension broke. He found his peace. He left the dance that night, went home, and never attended a ball again. He traded the pursuit of societal status for the pursuit of the mission.
He didn't abandon his career, though. He eventually rose to incredibly high civil positions, working in the Treasury and eventually becoming the Secretary of the General Post Office.
But his defining lifelong habit became the relentless distribution of tracts. He adopted the exact tactics of the Edinburgh City Mission, talking to everyone he met, whether they were a lord or a laborer.
The tract includes a wonderful anecdote illustrating his persistence.
The train story, right?
Yes. He is traveling on a train down from Aberdeen, sharing a carriage with an old, grumpy man. The man sighs and complains, "It's a long way to London."
And Blackwood, trained to look for any rhetorical opening, seizes on the word the devil. He uses it to pivot the conversation to the enemy of souls and hands the old man a small book.
The old man sits in silence, reads the pamphlet, and by the end of the journey, he takes Blackwood's hand with tears in his eyes and says, "If you've given me that pamphlet, sir, for the love of the Lord Jesus Christ, I shall see your face shining in glory."
It's an amazing interaction, and the interaction is so powerful that even a silent young woman sitting in the corner of the carriage who had been observing the entire exchange speaks up. She adds, "I shall meet you again at home, sir, for I'm traveling home too."
It's a beautiful story.
It is, but I have to play devil's advocate for a moment.
Okay, go ahead.
How does a narrative about a wealthy, high society military officer, the grandson of a Trafalgar captain, serve the specific purposes of the Edinburgh City Mission? Why are they spending their hard-earned printing budget to distribute the biography of an aristocrat to the poorest slums of Scotland?
This raises an important question, and the answer reveals the deep sophistication of their overall strategy. The Blackwood story wasn't just meant to convert the reader. It was vital proof of concept for the tract distributors themselves.
For the workers.
Exactly. It proved a fundamental thesis. Spiritual apathy and moral emptiness were not merely byproducts of poverty. They were universal human conditions that afflicted the wealthy, the educated, and the powerful just as deeply as the destitute.
That completely leveled the playing field. If you were a working-class layman walking the streets of Edinburgh, handing out pamphlets, you might struggle with an inferiority complex.
You might.
But the Blackwood story tells you that the richest man in the city is suffering from the exact same internal void as the poorest.
Exactly. And more importantly, it validated the core mechanism of the mission strategy. It proved that a simple, cheap paper book handed to a stranger by a distributor or sent in the mail by a praying mother possessed intrinsic power.
Right.
It could act as a delayed reaction catalyst. That book might sit ignored in a freezing tent during a military siege for weeks until the environmental conditions were right. But when it was finally opened, it possessed the power to trigger total, permanent life transformation.
It armed the everyday layperson with the profound confidence that they were carrying a highly effective, universally applicable tool.
That is exactly what it did.
That is an incredible synthesis of everything we've discussed. We have covered an immense amount of historical and psychological ground today. We started in that small, crowded shop on the High Street in March 1832, examining the radical, dangerous idea to abandon the comfortable, attractive model and launch a massive, aggressive campaign.
We saw how Mr. Naismith and the founders built a highly structured, decentralized organization utilizing strict rules and daily data journals to micromanage a volatile workforce and enforce operational efficiency over denominational tribalism.
We looked at the gritty economics, the 146-pound district debts, and the realization that all the visionary zeal in the world would have collapsed without the relentless, silent financial backing of the ladies' associations and their drawing room fundraising.
And we explored the mass media of the 19th century, the carefully engineered tracts that utilized brilliant psychological framing, moving from the intense pressure of sudden death to the radical comfort of the lifeboat and the smoking flax, proving their effectiveness from the poorest alleys of Edinburgh all the way to the officer tents of the Crimean War.
So what does this all mean? As we wrap up this journey, what does all of this 19th century history mean for you listening today?
Right. Why should they care?
I think it serves as a powerful reminder that massive citywide cultural shifts rarely, if ever, originate from massive established government institutions or comfortable bureaucracies. They almost always start with individuals.
Yes.
A handful of ordinary people sitting in a shop, recognizing a profound human need and deciding to step out of their comfort zones. They chose to organize their efforts, embrace the friction, and speak directly face-to-face with their neighbors.
They recognize that you cannot enforce human flourishing from a distance. You have to build a systematic, scalable engine to meet people exactly where they are suffering.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We live in a modern, hyper-digital world where almost all of our communication is carefully curated. It is an era of inbound marketing.
Absolutely.
We build our sleek digital lighthouses, we optimize our content, and we sit back and wait for the clicks, the likes, and the foot traffic. We have retreated back into the attractive model. So what is the 21st century equivalent of the 1832 aggressive method?
That is a great question.
What happens when we finally decide to step out from behind the safety of our screens, leave the comfortable lighthouse, and meet people exactly where they are, uninvited perhaps, but genuinely, fiercely caring about their ultimate well-being in the middle of the storm? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.